We'll never see prime Joel Embiid ever again. This could be the moment where everything starts to decline, and the warning signs have been there all along. The 76ers season has been nothing short of disastrous, an absolute nightmare for their fans. Early in the year, there was at least some excitement with Jared McCain, who was emerging as the clear frontrunner for Rookie of the Year, but then he went down with an injury, and from that point on, things only got worse. Simply put, the 76ers just can't win basketball games, and injuries are the main reason why. It's gotten so bad that Joel Embiid has now been ruled out for the rest of the season. Considering we're well past the midway point and heading towards the playoffs, this feels long overdue. By now, he should have been fully rehabbed. Instead, it seems like the front office prioritized their investment over his health, pushing him to play despite knowing he wasn't anywhere near 100% just to justify his massive contract. And when he did play, it was tough to watch. He could barely move, and every game felt like a struggle. In total, he managed just 19 games. That small sample size made one thing painfully obvious: he had no business being on the court. At this point, even walking looks like a challenge for him. Honestly, I didn't see the point of putting Embiid out there for those games. He contributed so little because he was barely able to play, and it would have been better if he had just stayed home. All he did was put more strain on his knees, whether from long flights between cities or the wear and tear of playing. I'd much rather have seen him sit out the entire season and be in slightly better shape than just play 19 games and end up worse off. If he chose to do that, he'd face a lot of criticism because that's the reality of today's sports culture. Questioning the legitimacy of players' injuries has become far too normalized. To be fair, there are cases where skepticism is warranted. Some players do exaggerate or even cause their own injuries. Take Zion Williamson, for example. The setbacks he's faced in his career have largely been self-inflicted due to his refusal to lose weight. Then there's Ben Simmons. When he first arrived in Brooklyn, he sat out a significant number of games, often citing a back injury, but it was clear that his struggles were more mental than physical. Joel Embiid, however, is dealing with a legitimate injury. Unlike Zion, his situation isn't self-inflicted. At 6'6", Zion could realistically slim down to a healthier playing weight, whereas Embiid, at 7 foot tall, carries 280 pounds in a way that isn't entirely within his control. And unlike Simmons, this isn't a case of personal issues being masked as a physical injury. Embiid's knee problems are very real. Constantly questioning injuries like his only adds pressure on players to return before they're ready. That's exactly what happened with Embiid this season. He likely felt the need to push through when in reality, he should have never suited up for the 76ers at all. And this is happening in an era where load management is more accepted than ever. Imagine if he played in the 80s or 90s, he likely wouldn't have lasted this long. We might have only seen the first 3 years of his career, missing out on his MVP season and peak performances simply because he wouldn't have had the same medical resources and recovery options. Not to mention, the fan base would have been even harsher on him for sitting out. In a way, this is the best case scenario for Embiid. Even coming into the league, injury concerns kept him from being the number 1 overall pick. He could have easily been drafted ahead of Jabari Parker, maybe not over Andrew Wiggins, who was highly regarded at the time, but he certainly had the talent to be a top 2 pick if not for the fear of injuries. That just goes to show this isn't a new concern. If teams knew Embiid's health was a concern back in 2014, you'd think they'd take that into account in 2025, but instead 76ers GM Daryl Morey gave him a 3-year $193 million extension before this season. That's a bad contract. It's not quite as terrible as Bradley Beal's deal, which includes a no-trade clause, but it's still up there. To be clear, I'm not saying that the 76ers should have let their star player walk just to avoid paying him, but they could have at least negotiated a smaller deal. Embiid has played his entire career in Philly. He clearly has loyalty to the team, and the 76ers have shown their loyalty as well, making moves to try and contend. They brought in Jimmy Butler, they got James Harden, both players capable of winning at a high level, but despite these efforts, they still fell short of a championship. However, when you fail, you regroup and try again, and the 76ers weren't ready to give up on the process. So this past offseason, they made their biggest move yet, signing Paul George. At the time, the move was widely praised, with many expecting the 76ers to be a 50-plus win team. A trio of Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, and Joel Embiid was supposed to rival the defending champion Boston Celtics, but instead of getting the elite Paul George, Philadelphia ended up with Podcast P. Nobody asked for Podcast P. To be clear, I have no issue with athletes building their social media presence, but it's always been a little strange when active players start commenting like analysts. Take Draymond Green, for example. One of his podcast episodes that rubbed me the wrong way was when he called Russell Westbrook the perfect player for Jokic and the Nuggets. It just felt weird, like you're still playing in the same conference as these guys. You'll be competing against them, talking trash on the court, and Russ could easily fire back with, "Didn't you just say I was a perfect player?" I do appreciate that these player-run podcasts offer real inside knowledge about the game, but with Paul George, we've seen more of the negatives. At times, he comes off as having an inflated ego, surrounded by yes-men who agree with everything he says. I'm not hating on it, but I understand why people take an issue with it. How can PG have the most dysfunctional season of his career, then hop on a podcast and act like nothing's wrong? Fans were roasting him in the comment section of every episode, so eventually he made a big announcement about the future of his podcast.
Before we wrap, fellas, it's no secret this season is, up to this point, man, it hasn't been what we envisioned. I know my goal when I first signed with Philadelphia was to bring a championship to these amazing fans here. I want to let the Podcast P family know that after today's episode with Dwight, I plan to take a break from the pod just to focus on getting my body right, getting mentally right, and, help this squad make a push.
Pause. This is the biggest news since Luka getting traded to the Lakers. No more Podcast P. And also, why is that guy shaking his head so much? He's doing too much. Anyways, no more Podcast P. It took him long enough. I mean, if he really believed the podcast was distracting him, he should have shut it down a long time ago. And what's with the whole bringing a championship to these wonderful 76ers fans speech? That ship has sailed. He must be talking about next season because there's no saving this one. Honestly, I doubt PG wanted to stop the podcast. He probably was making good money from it and could see himself continuing for the rest of his contract in Philly, where he just shoots 1 of 7 from the field, goes 0 of 5 from 3, loses the game, and then heads home to record another episode. If it weren't for the backlash and the damage to his legacy, he probably wouldn't have stopped at all. And we know he cares about public perception. Just look at how he complained about Pacers fans booing him every time he returns to Indy. Nobody cares though. Like, did he expect them to roll out a red carpet for him? Same thing with the podcast. He thought fans would just accept every episode while the 76ers continue to spiral out of control. But that didn't happen. And let's be real, this is probably just a temporary break. Once the noise dies down, he'll likely be right back at it. Honestly, he might as well have just kept going because it's not like this season could be saved. Plus, making a podcast doesn't take that much time. If all I had to do was press record and talk, my editing time would be cut in half. And PG definitely has editors handling the production for him. I just can't picture him coming home from a late game at the Wells Fargo Center, pulling out his laptop and chopping up clips in CapCut. Maybe I'm wrong, but I highly doubt it. Overall, I don't feel bad for Paul George. I don't think many people do, but there's always going to be a group that sympathizes with him. After all, he's a favorite player for a lot of people. Take Kyan Anthony, Carmelo's son. He's a fan of PG, and it makes sense because George is the ultimate mixtape player. He's a tall wing with guard-like handles, and his highlights are everywhere. Slow motion clips set to Didn't You Know by Erykah Badu, edited with smooth transitions, making him someone's favorite player all over again. So I get it. Strictly from a basketball perspective, Paul George is fun to watch, but the decisions he makes, questionable to say the least. I can't feel bad for a guy who willingly left an injury-prone superstar in LA, Kawhi Leonard, just to team up with another injury-prone superstar across the country. He put himself in this situation. He could have taken a pay cut and stayed with the Clippers, but instead he demanded the same contract as Kawhi. And the Clippers weren't like the yes men on his podcast who agree with everything he says. They told him no, because PG just isn't on the same level as Kawhi. Feeling disrespected, he left and joined a team built around a franchise player who was clearly a shell of his former self. Did PG not watch Joel Embiid in the Olympics? He looked terrible. He had no business being out there. Playing for Team USA wasn't mandatory, but Embiid still chose to punish his body further instead of prioritizing recovery. It was a bad decision, but he likely did it because he wanted to represent his American-born son. That's understandable, but PG should have seen the writing on the wall. Embiid wasn't going to be himself this season, and George should have backed out before it was too late. It's widely known that a championship window for a team built around a big man is much shorter than one built around a guard. 7-footers can only stay mobile for so long, which means their teams have a much smaller window to compete compared to teams led by guards who typically have better longevity. Take Steph Curry, for example. No matter how you look at it, he's always going to age better than Joel Embiid because he doesn't carry as much weight or put as much strain on his body. And Embiid's size doesn't just impact his durability, it also complicates his recovery options. One potential solution for his knee issues could be a meniscus transplant. The only player I know who has successfully undergone that procedure is Lonzo Ball, but Lonzo is 6 inches shorter and nearly 90 pounds lighter, meaning that he can recover from an extreme surgery like that much faster than someone Embiid's size. For Embiid, the Sixers are just going to have to hope that whatever treatment he undergoes this offseason actually works. At this point, Philadelphia's best move is to tank. If they land a top 6 pick in the draft, they get to keep it, but if it falls outside the top 6, it goes to the Thunder. So the Sixers need to be strategic. That means resting Paul George, who's also been dealing with injuries, putting Tyrese Maxey on a mittens restriction, and limiting anyone else who could help them win too many games. If they secure a high draft pick, it could be a game changer. This year's draft is loaded with talented wings, so if the Sixers can land a strong wing player, it might make sense to part ways with Paul George even if they don't get much in return, just to clear space at that position. After all, they already have Tyrese Maxey and Jared McCain, which might be enough if they're truly planning to hit the reset button. An even bigger question is, what if they land a top 6 pick and a high-level center is available? Let's say Maryland's Derek Queen is still on the board, a player projected to go 6th in a lot of mock drafts. Do they take him even if it risks upsetting Embiid? If I were them, I'd say yes. When Embiid returns, he's not going to be the MVP caliber player he once was. At best, he'll be a solid all-star level talent. It might be time for the Sixers to accept that the process never truly paid off and start preparing for a full rebuild. But what do you think? Is Joel Embiid's prime officially over? Tell me in the comment section below. Until next time, peace.